The day freedom came to the Deep South, it did not come with a meal. Thousands of men, women, and children stepped off plantations with nothing but what they knew. No land, no wages, no pantry. But they knew food. They knew which roots grew wild along the creek and which parts of the hog could feed a family for a week. Number 19 on this list started in a muddy swamp and ended up on dining tables the wealthy paid good money to sit at. One entry further down grew wild in every southern forest, and most people walking past it today have no idea it is food. And number 14 required a full week of patience before it was even ready for the pot. Hit subscribe because this is the food history that built the South from the ground up. Here are 25 foods freedmen actually ate after emancipation in the Deep South. Number 25, parched corn. Before a freedman could grind corn into meal or boil it into hominy, there was an even simpler way to eat it. Dried kernels were spread in a dry skillet or scattered across a flat stone set over coals and stirred until they cracked open and turned brown. No fat, no water, no seasoning required. The heat transformed the starch into something crunchy, slightly sweet, and light enough to carry in a pocket or a cloth sack for days without spoiling. Parched corn was trail food, field food, and hunger food all at once. A man heading out before dawn to work land he did not own could fill a handful from the jar by the door and eat it walking. Children chewed it between meals the way later generations would chew candy. It was the simplest thing corn could become, and for freedmen who had nothing else ready, it was enough. Number 24, hominy. Freedmen soaked dried corn kernels in water mixed with lye made from hardwood ashes. The alkaline solution loosened the hulls and swelled the kernels to twice their original size. After rinsing, the pale, puffy grains were boiled slowly until they were tender enough to chew. Hominy was eaten as a side alongside pork or greens, fried in a skillet the next morning with whatever fat was available, or ground into grits when a hand mill could be found. The lye treatment did something that plain grinding could not. It released nutrients locked inside the corn that the body could not otherwise absorb. Freedmen did not know the chemistry. They knew the practice, passed down from generations of contact between enslaved Africans and native peoples in the South. The technique survived because it worked and because corn was the one crop a landless man could always grow. Number 23, poke salat. Every spring, pokeweed pushed up through the disturbed ground along fence rows, barn lots, and the edges of plowed fields. The young shoots and tender leaves were one of the first greens available after a long winter of dry beans and salt meat. But pokeweed carried a problem. The plant was toxic if prepared wrong. Freedmen knew the method that made it safe. The leaves were boiled in a full pot of water, drained completely, boiled again in fresh water, drained again, and boiled a third time before they were fit to eat. After 3 changes of water, the greens were wilted down to a dark, soft mass that tasted mild and earthy. Fried in bacon grease with a little salt, poke salat was a springtime staple that cost nothing and grew without asking. The trick was knowing when to pick it. Young leaves were safe after proper boiling. Mature stalks and berries were dangerous, and everyone in a freedman's household learned the difference early. Number 22, pig ears. After a hog was slaughtered and the hams, shoulders, and ribs were claimed, the ears were left behind with the rest of what most people considered waste. Freedmen took them. The ears were scrubbed clean, singed of any remaining hair, and simmered in a pot for hours until the cartilage softened and the skin turned tender and gelatinous. Some families chopped them and added them to stews. Others pickled them in vinegar with hot pepper and onion, storing the jars for weeks. The texture was unlike any other cut of pork, part silky, part chewy, with a richness that came from the collagen dissolving slowly during the long cook. A jar of pickled pig ears sitting on a shelf represented protein that required no ice, no smokehouse, and no rush to eat before it spoiled. Number 21, squirrel. In the woods and fence rows of the Deep South, squirrels were as common as daylight. Freedmen hunted them with traps, slingshots, and small caliber rifles when ammunition could be spared. The animal was skinned, cleaned, and stewed low and slow with onions and root vegetables until the small, tough muscles surrendered and the meat fell away from the bone. Squirrel stew was a weekday supper in freedmen's households near wooded land. The flavor was mild, closer to chicken than to the stronger wild game. A single squirrel was not much, but a morning in the woods could produce 3 or 4, and that was enough for a pot that fed the family. Children learned to hunt squirrel before they learned almost anything else about putting food on the table. Number 20, salt herring. Barrels of salted herring arrived in the Deep South by rail and by a river barge from the Atlantic coast. The fish were cheap, heavily preserved, and sold in country stores where freedmen bought supplies on credit. A single herring was stiff as a board, crusted in salt, and had to be soaked in water overnight before it could be cooked. Once the salt was drawn out, the fish was fried in a skillet or simmered with potatoes and onion. The flavor was strong, briny, and unmistakably fishy. It was not a delicacy. It was a way to get animal protein on the table when fresh meat was out of reach and the nearest creek was fished out. Salt herring kept for months without ice. It traveled well, and a single barrel could feed a family through the leaner weeks of late winter when the smokehouse was empty and the garden had not yet come up. Number 19, turtle. In the swamps, creeks, and slow-moving rivers of the Deep South, snapping turtles and soft-shelled turtles were plentiful. Freedmen caught them by hand with traps made from bent saplings or on lines baited with chicken scraps. Getting a large, snapping turtle out of the water without losing a finger was a skill passed between fathers and sons, and the men who could do it consistently earned a reputation in their communities. The turtle was killed, the shell removed, and the meat cut into pieces. The meat was simmered in a heavy pot with onions, root vegetables, and whatever herbs could be found until the broth turned rich and dark. The flavor was unlike any other meat in a freedman's kitchen, somewhere between chicken and fish, with a density that made a small portion feel like a full meal. What makes turtle remarkable in this story is where it ended up. By the late 1800s, turtle soup had become a fashionable dish in the dining rooms of the wealthy across the South and along the eastern seaboard. Hotels served it. Fine restaurants featured it. The very same animal that freedmen pulled from swamp mud appeared on linen-covered tables in cities where most black people were not allowed to sit down. Freedmen who had once caught turtles for their own families began selling them to markets and suppliers, turning a subsistence food into a source of income. But the irony ran deep. The people who had perfected the dish in poverty watched it become someone else's luxury without receiving credit or a fair share of the price. The soup tasted the same regardless of whose table it sat on. The difference was always who got paid and who did the work. Number 18, wild blackberries. In late spring and early summer, blackberry brambles covered the fence rows, ditch banks, and forest edges of the Deep South. Freedmen's families picked the berries by the bucketful, enduring thorns that scratched arms and stained hands purple for days. The berries were eaten fresh, cooked down into jam with whatever sugar could be spared, baked into cobblers when flour was available, or simply mashed and stirred into cornbread batter for sweetness. Children ate them straight off the bush, fingers and mouths stained dark. Wild blackberries needed no planting, no watering, and no permission. They grew where nothing else useful would, on land too rough for crops. For freedmen who owned nothing, a good blackberry thicket was as close to a guarantee as the natural world could offer. Number 17, cowpeas. Long before they became known as black-eyed peas in grocery stores, cowpeas were a field crop that freedmen planted in rows between corn stalks or along the borders of cotton patches. The plants fixed nitrogen in the soil, which meant they actually improved the ground they grew in rather than exhausting it. Dried on the vine and shelled by hand into sacks, cowpeas stored for months without spoiling. Cooked low and slow with a piece of salt meat and a chopped onion, they turned into a thick, creamy pot of food that was high in protein and filling enough to anchor a meal on its own. Freedmen ate them nearly every day during the months when fresh vegetables were not available. Mixed with rice, they became the dish that would eventually be called Hoppin' John, though freedmen's families did not call it that. They called it supper. Number 16, crawfish. In Louisiana and the lowland parishes of the Deep South, crawfish lived in every ditch, rice field, and muddy creek bottom. Freedmen caught them with simple traps made from wire and scrap wood, or pulled them by hand from the shallow water where the animals burrowed. The catch required no equipment, no ammunition, and no permission from anyone. Crawfish were boiled alive in a large pot with salt and cayenne pepper. The meat inside the tail was sweet and tender. Families gathered around long tables and ate them by the pound, cracking the shells and sucking the fat from the heads. That communal gathering traces a direct line back to freedmen in the Louisiana parishes who needed a cheap protein they could harvest with their own hands. The animal was everywhere, and it cost nothing but time and a willingness to get muddy. Number 15, leather breeches. When green beans came in heavy during the summer, freedmen's families could not eat them all before they spoiled. There was no refrigeration and no canning equipment, so the beans were threaded onto long strings using a needle and heavy thread, hung from rafters or porch ceilings and left to dry in the open air until they shriveled into tough, leathery strips. That was how they got the name. Stored in cloth sacks, leather breeches kept through the entire winter. When a family needed them, a handful was dropped into a pot of water with a piece of salt pork and simmered for hours until they rehydrated and turned tender. The flavor after that long, slow cook was deeper and more concentrated than any fresh green bean, almost smoky. Leather breeches were summer preserved for winter, a bridge across the months when nothing grew. Number 14, opossum. The opossum was one of the most peculiar animals a freedman could bring home for supper. It was hunted at night, usually treed by dogs, and pulled from the branches by hand or shaken loose. The animal had a reputation for playing dead when cornered, which made catching it easier than almost any other game in the Deep South. But the real work began after the catch. A freshly caught opossum was not cooked right away. Many freedmen penned the animal alive for a week or two, feeding it scraps and clean food to flush out whatever the opossum had been eating in the wild. The practice was called cleaning out, and it made the difference between meat that tasted mild and meat that tasted like whatever the animal had scavenged from ditches and refuse piles. Once cleaned out, the opossum was scalded, scraped of its hair, gutted, and roasted whole in a heavy pan surrounded by sweet potatoes. The fat rendered down during roasting and basted the sweet potatoes until they turned golden and soft. The combination of roasted opossum and sweet potatoes became one of the most recognized freedmen's meals in the Deep South, a dish substantial enough to anchor a gathering. Opossum hunting was community knowledge. The men who knew which trees the animals favored, which hollows they denned in during the day, and which dogs could tree them reliably were valued in their settlements. A good opossum hunter could feed his family through stretches when no other meat was available. The dish has largely vanished from modern Southern cooking, but in the decades after Emancipation, roasted opossum with sweet potatoes on a cold night was not a curiosity. It was supper, and the family sitting around that table considered themselves fortunate to have it. Number 13, catfish. Every creek, river, pond, and drainage ditch in the Deep South held catfish. For freedmen who lived near water, fishing was one of the most reliable ways to put protein on the table without spending a cent or depending on a landlord. Catfish were caught on trot lines, hand lines, and sometimes by hand in the muddy banks where the fish burrowed during the day. The fish were cleaned, rolled in cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet in hot lard or fatback grease. That preparation, cornmeal crusted fried catfish, became one of the signature dishes of Southern Black cooking. It required almost nothing beyond the fish, cornmeal, and a little fat. Families gathered at fish fries along rivers and creek banks, and those gatherings became social institutions that lasted for generations. The Friday night fish fry in Black communities across the South traces a direct line back to freedmen cooking what they caught with their own hands. Here's something worth understanding before this list goes further. When emancipation came, it did not come with a kitchen. Most freedmen in the Deep South owned nothing. The Freedmen's Bureau distributed rations in the early years after the war, mostly cornmeal, salt pork, and hardtack, but those supplies were unreliable and ended quickly. What freedmen carried with them was knowledge. Generations of enslaved cooks had learned to identify wild plants, to butcher and preserve meat, to stretch a handful of grain into a meal for a family. That knowledge was not written in any book. It lived in hands, in habits, and in the memory of watching someone else do it first. Every food that follows exists because someone remembered how to make it and taught someone else before the knowledge was lost. Number 12, mayhaw jelly. Deep in the swamps and bottomlands of the Gulf South, a small, thorny tree produced clusters of bright red berries every spring. Mayhaws ripened in shallow water, and freedmen gathered them by wading into flooded lowlands with buckets or by spreading sheets beneath the trees and shaking the branches. The raw berries were too tart to eat straight. Boiled down and strained, the juice was cooked with sugar into a clear, ruby-colored jelly with a flavor that sat somewhere between a crabapple and a cranberry, sharp and sweet at once. A few jars of mayhaw jelly put up in the spring lasted through the year and went on biscuits, cornbread, and anything else that needed brightening. The trees grew in places most people avoided, in standing water and tangled brush where snakes lived. Freedmen who knew where the trees stood and when the fruit was ready had access to something no store sold and no landlord controlled. Number 11, dove. Mourning doves fed in harvested grain fields and along dirt roads across the Deep South in numbers that seemed endless. Freedmen trapped them with simple snares or knocked them from fence posts with thrown sticks. The birds were tiny, barely a few ounces of meat each, but they were so abundant that a determined person could gather a dozen in a single afternoon. Plucked and cleaned, a dove was split open, pressed flat, and fried quickly in hot lard. The breast meat was dark, tender, and richer than any domestic poultry, with a faintly gamey edge from a diet of wild seeds and grain. A plate of fried dove stacked like small medallions alongside a pile of rice, was a meal that looked modest but tasted like something far more expensive than it was. Number 10, persimmon beer. Most people today do not know that persimmons grow wild across the Deep South. The small orange fruit ripens in late fall and is so astringent when unripe that it will turn the inside of a mouth inside out. But when a persimmon is fully ripe, nearly soft enough to fall apart in the hand, it turns sweet and rich. Freedmen gathered ripe persimmons by the basketful, mashed them into a pulp, mixed the pulp with water and sometimes a little cornmeal or bran, and let the mixture ferment in a jug or a crock for several days. The result was a mildly alcoholic, slightly sweet drink that tasted nothing like commercial beer. Persimmon beer was a harvest season tradition that cost nothing and required no equipment beyond a container and patience. It was one of the small pleasures available to people who had very few of them. Number 9, groundhog. In the upper reaches of the Deep South, where the land rolled into red clay hills and Piedmont forests, groundhogs were common along field edges and rocky embankments. Freedmen hunted them with dogs or dug them from their burrows. The animal was heavy for its size, and a single groundhog could yield several pounds of dark, dense meat. Skinned and cleaned, the meat was parboiled first to draw off excess fat, then roasted in a heavy pan or stewed with root vegetables until it turned tender. The flavor was strong, somewhere between pork and dark poultry, and it carried the taste of whatever the animal had been eating, mostly clover, grass, and garden crops. Groundhog was not glamorous food, but it was free, it was plentiful in the warm months, and a family that caught one had a real meal without spending anything or asking anyone's permission. Number 8, bend seeds. The small flat seeds that most people today call sesame arrived in the Deep South inside the memories of enslaved West Africans who had grown the plant for generations before they were taken. After Emancipation, freedmen continued planting benny in garden rows and along field borders. The plants grew tall, flowered, and produced pods that dried and split open to release hundreds of tiny seeds. Freedmen toasted the seeds in a dry skillet until they turned golden and fragrant, then scattered them over rice, stirred them into soups, or ground them into a paste. In the coastal low country, bend wafers, thin, crisp cookies made from toasted seeds, sugar, and flour became a recognized local delicacy. The plant itself needed almost nothing. It tolerated poor soil, drought, and heat. Benny was one of the few foods on this list that freedmen did not learn in America. They brought it with them, and they refused to let it disappear. Number 7, pawpaw. Deep in the shaded understory of southern forests, a tree grew that bore the largest edible fruit native to North America. The pawpaw ripened in late summer and early fall, and when it was ready, the fruit turned from green to a mottled yellow-brown and gave off a fragrance so strong it could be detected from several yards away. Freedmen knew where the pawpaw trees grew because the knowledge had been handed down. The fruit was not sold in any store. It did not travel well, bruised at the slightest pressure, and rotted within days of ripening. But eaten fresh from the tree, the pawpaw was remarkable. The flesh was creamy, custard soft and sweet, with a flavor somewhere between banana and mango, nothing like anything else that grew in the American South. Freedmen gathered pawpaws by the basketful during the short window when the fruit was ripe. They ate them raw, mashed them into puddings, and stirred the pulp into cornbread batter for a sweetness that cost nothing. Children scrambled to find the trees before the wildlife stripped them clean. The pawpaw never became a commercial crop. The fruit bruised too easily and rotted too fast for anyone to sell it beyond a day's walk. But for families who lived close enough, the pawpaw was one of the most generous gifts the forest offered. It appeared once a year, lasted only a few weeks, and then vanished. Freedmen treated the pawpaw patches the way they treated the best fishing holes. The locations were shared within the community and remembered across generations. Number 6, turnip roots. Most people who talk about turnips in the context of Southern cooking mean the greens, but freedmen ate the root just as often. Turnips grew fast in the cool months of fall and early winter, producing a solid, starchy vegetable in soil too cold and too tired for other crops. The roots were peeled and boiled until soft, mashed with a little salt and fat, or cut into chunks and dropped into stews where they absorbed the flavor of whatever meat was in the pot. A freedman could plant turnip seed in September and pull roots by November. That timing mattered. The harvest came at exactly the point when the summer garden was finished and the preserved stores were not yet needed. Turnips stored well in root cellars, lasting weeks in cool, dry earth. The flavor was plain, the nutrition was real, the timing was everything. Number 5, watercress. In the shaded creeks and spring-fed streams that ran through the deep South, watercress grew in thick, tangled mats just below the surface of the water. Freedmen waded in and pulled it out by the handful. The leaves were small, round, and bright green, with a sharp, peppery bite that hit the back of the tongue and lingered. Eaten raw, watercress was one of the few truly fresh greens available in late winter and early spring when garden crops had not yet come up and stores' food was running low. It was tossed into salads with wild onions, wilted in a skillet with bacon grease, or floated in soups and broths as a last-minute addition. Watercress grew year-round in moving water. It required no cultivation, and it carried more iron and more vitamins per handful than almost any cultivated green a person could grow in a garden. Here is the part of this story that rarely gets told. After Emancipation, most freedmen did not leave. They stayed on the same land, often working for the same families who had enslaved them under sharecropping. A freedman farmed a plot owned by someone else and paid with a share of the crop, usually half or more. Whatever remained had to cover food, seed, and tools, often bought on credit from a store the landowner also controlled. The prices were high, the records were kept by the landlord, the arithmetic never worked in the freedman's favor. Every dish from here forward was cooked under those conditions. Number 4, corn pone. Cornbread in all its forms was the single most important bread in a freedman's kitchen. Wheat flour was expensive and had to be purchased. Corn could be grown on a small plot, taken to a local mill, and ground into meal at a fraction of the cost. Freedmen made corn pone, which was cornbread baked without milk or eggs, just meal, water, salt, and a scrape of fat. They made hoe cakes flat on iron over the fire. They made skillet cornbread when they had a cast iron pan, and they made spoon bread on the rare occasions when eggs and milk were both available. Corn pone appeared at every meal. It went into the broth, sat beside the greens, and soaked up the liquid from the beans. A freedman's family could survive for weeks on cornmeal, salt, and water alone. Many of them did exactly that. Number 3, molasses. In the sugar-producing parishes of Louisiana and the lower South, molasses was the cheapest sweetener a family could find because it was the byproduct the sugar refineries did not want. The thick, dark syrup was sold for almost nothing or given away outright, and freedmen used it the way wealthier families used white sugar. Molasses went on biscuits, into cornbread batter, over roasted sweet potatoes, and into gingerbread when flour could be found. Children ate it straight from the spoon. Mixed with a little water, it became a drink. Mixed with vinegar, it served as a folk remedy for sore throats and winter coughs. The deep, heavy flavor of blackstrap molasses is something a person either grew up with or learns to tolerate. For Freedmen's families, the taste was beside the point. The calories and the sweetness were what kept the household moving. Number 2, chinkapin nuts. Before the chestnut blight swept through the eastern forests in the early 1900s, chinkapin trees grew wild across the deep south. The nuts were smaller than chestnuts, but just as sweet, encased in spiny burrs that split open when ripe. Freedmen's children gathered them from the forest floor in autumn, filling pockets and sacks with as many as they could carry. The nuts were roasted in the ashes of a fire or boiled in salted water and eaten warm. The flavor was rich and starchy, somewhere between a chestnut and a hazelnut, and nothing else foraged from the woods tasted quite like them. Chinquapins were a food that required no work beyond knowing where the trees stood and arriving before the squirrels and wild turkeys cleaned the ground bare. The trees are mostly gone now, thinned by the same blight that destroyed the American chestnut, and the taste of a roasted chinquapin is something only the oldest living Southerners remember. There is a pattern running through this list that deserves to be named. Nearly every food here started as something rejected. The organs, the wild roots, the foraged fruit nobody bothered to pick. Freedmen ate them because these were the only foods the system left within reach. And then something happened. Over generations, those rejected ingredients were transformed by skill and sheer creative force into a cuisine. What began as survival became culture. The modern world calls it soul food. In the years right after Emancipation, nobody called it anything. It was just what was for supper. Number 1, smoked ham hock. The ham hock is the joint between the leg and the foot of a hog, a knob of bone wrapped in skin, collagen, and a small amount of meat. It was the cheapest cut of pork because there was almost nothing on it to eat. That was the wrong way to understand it. A freedman did not buy a ham hock to eat. A freedman bought a ham hock to cook with. One smoked ham hock dropped into a pot of greens, a pot of beans, or a pot of field peas transformed plain water into something that tasted like a meal. The smoke, the salt, the fat, and the gelatin from the bone seeped into everything around it. Nearly every pot on this list had a ham hock at the bottom of it. That is the story this list tells in full. Freedmen were left with the ingredients nobody else wanted: the scraps, the weeds, the wild things, the cheapest parts of the cheapest animal. What they built from those ingredients was a cuisine that fed a people through the hardest decades in American history and became the foundation of what the world now calls soul food. Nobody handed them a tradition. They made one.
Boiled custard was Christmas in a cup, a silky, drinkable dessert that African American families stirred slowly over low heat until it coated the back of a spoon. Unlike store-bought eggnog, this was made from scratch with eggs, sugar, milk, and vanilla, cooked with patience that couldn't be rushed. The process required constant stirring to prevent curdling, a skill grandmothers passed to daughters while sharing stories. Served chilled in small glasses, boiled custard was rich enough to feel like dessert, but light enough to sip throughout Christmas Day. Some families added a splash of bourbon for the adults, creating a version that warmed from the inside out. Children would beg for just one more glass, their upper lips painted white with creamy sweetness. The custard was often made Christmas Eve, chilling overnight so the flavors could deepen. Boiled custard represented patience and tradition, proof that the best Christmas treats couldn't be rushed or purchased.
Molasses cake was the closest thing to dessert most enslaved people would taste at Christmas, baked in cast iron skillets over cabin fires. Molasses was the cheapest sweetener, the dark byproduct of sugar refining that plantation owners considered beneath their tables but distributed to quarters. Mixed with cornmeal or rare wheat flour, eggs when available, and gathered spices, the batter baked into dense, moist cake with deep, almost burnt sweetness. The flavor was intense, far removed from delicate cakes served in the big house, but beloved in its own way. Women who made exceptional molasses cake earned reputations spreading across plantations, their recipes guarded and whispered. Children hovered near the fire, watching for signs the cake was ready. Each slice represented weeks of careful hoarding, extra molasses saved, flour hidden away, eggs collected one by one until enough existed to create something truly celebratory from almost nothing.
Chinquapin nut meal was a secret storehouse of strength, hidden in plain sight among the trees. The chinquapin, a cousin of the chestnut, produced small, sweet nuts that could be gathered in the fall and ground into a fine meal. Enslaved families crushed them using stones, drying the powder in the sun to keep for months. When flour was impossible to come by, this nut meal became bread, porridge, and thickener all at once. It was light to carry but heavy with sustenance, a survival food that kept bellies full during harsh winters or long journeys. The taste was earthy, buttery, faintly sweet, a reminder that even the smallest things in nature held power. The chinquapin tree itself became a silent ally, standing in the background of survival stories few ever told. Every handful of its meal was a small victory against hunger and hardship. Molasses taffy was Christmas entertainment disguised as candy, a sticky-pulled confection that turned entire African-American families into taffy-pulling teams on cold December evenings. The process began with boiling molasses, sugar, and butter until it reached the hardball stage, then pouring the hot mixture onto buttered platters to cool. Once it could be handled, the real fun began. Everyone would butter their hands and start pulling, stretching the dark mass until it lightened in color and developed that signature chewy texture. Children loved the mess, the laughter, and the competition to see who could pull the longest strand. The finished taffy was cut into pieces and wrapped in wax paper, stored in jars for the holiday season. This wasn't just candy, it was family bonding, a Christmas Eve tradition that created memories alongside sweets. Molasses taffy represented the old ways of doing things, when entertainment came from working together rather than watching screens.
Crackling bread was a Christmas treat that transformed hog butchering scraps into something children waited for all year. When slaveholders slaughtered hogs in December, rendered fat left behind crispy bits of skin called cracklings. These golden, crunchy pieces were mixed into cornmeal batter and baked into bread that snapped with each bite. The bread was dense and satisfying, with pockets of salty, porky flavor throughout the golden crumb. Enslaved families considered crackling bread special because cracklings were only available during winter butchering season. Mothers saved the best pieces, hiding them until enough had been collected for a proper batch. The aroma of crackling, bread baking filled small cabins with warmth and anticipation, signaling the holiday had arrived. This simple bread carried enormous emotional weight, a reminder that even within slavery's brutal system, moments of sweetness could be created from scraps others discarded without thought.
Pralines were the Christmas candy that connected African-American families to New Orleans traditions, a creamy pecan confection that spread through Black communities across the South. Made from brown sugar, butter, cream, and whole pecans, pralines required careful attention to temperature and timing to achieve their signature texture. Creamy, yet firm, sweet, yet deeply caramelized. Black families made pralines in large batches during weeks before Christmas, storing them in tins for gift-giving and visitors. The process was social, with women gathering in kitchens to stir, test, and drop the candy onto buttered marble or wax paper. Children learned to judge readiness by the way the mixture fell from a spoon, forming soft mounds that set into perfect circles. Each family had their own ratio of pecans to sugar, some preferring more nuts, others favoring creamier candy. Pralines were given to teachers, mail carriers, and church members as tokens. This candy carried culture and community in every bite.
Chitlins with hot pepper vinegar was a Christmas dish requiring days of preparation and representing the ultimate example of making treasure from what others discarded. Chitlins, cleaned hog intestines, were given to enslaved workers after butchering because white families refused them. The cleaning process was intensive, requiring multiple soakings in cold water. Once cleaned, chitlins boiled for hours until tender, then served with vinegar spiked with hot peppers that cut through the richness. The powerful, distinctive smell filled quarters with an aroma announcing the holiday. Preparing chitlins was communal, with women gathering to clean and cook while sharing stories and songs. The dish carried African roots, connecting enslaved people to foodways their ancestors practiced before the Middle Passage. Eating chitlins at Christmas became an act of cultural preservation, a way of maintaining identity and community bonds that slavery sought to destroy.
Persimmon leather was a sweetness born from scarcity, made when sugar was a dream too far from reach. Wild persimmons, soft and golden when ripe, were gathered by hand and mashed into pulp, their tartness fading into deep honeyed flavor as they dried under the southern sun. Spread thin on boards or cloth, the pulp hardened into chewy sheets that could last for months, folded and stored for the hard winter ahead. It was candy made by patience, nutrition pressed into a form that would not spoil. The process itself was quiet work, often done at the edges of daylight, each batch a small defiance against hunger. When the cold arrived and food was scarce, a strip of persimmon leather could lift spirits and soothe hunger's edge. In its sweetness lived a lesson. Survival does not always mean bitterness. Sometimes it tastes like sunlight caught in fruit. Laine cake was the undisputed queen of African American Christmas celebrations, a towering confection that took days to prepare and demanded skills passed down through generations. Originating in Alabama during the late 1800s, this 4-layer white cake was filled with a bourbon-soaked mixture of raisins, pecans, and coconut that seemed almost sinful in its richness. Black families adopted and elevated this recipe, often adding extra whiskey or homemade vanilla. The preparation began days before Christmas, with the filling needing time to cure and the flavors melding into something magnificent. Women would crack pecans by hand, soak raisins in bourbon, and carefully separate dozens of eggs to achieve the perfect tender crumb. The white icing, applied in thick swirls, made the cake look like a snow-covered mountain. Children knew not to touch it until Christmas dinner was served. Laine cake represented more than dessert. It was proof that Black women could create elegance from simple ingredients.
Hog jowl and black-eyed peas carried deep meaning for enslaved communities, especially during Christmas when slaveholders sometimes distributed extra pork rations. The jowl was fatty cheek meat, considered undesirable by wealthy families, but treasured in quarters for its rich flavor and ability to season large pots. Black-eyed peas simmered slowly with the jowl until creamy and infused with smoky, salty essence. This combination became associated with luck and prosperity, beliefs enslaved people held fiercely despite their circumstances. One hog jowl could flavor enough peas to feed an entire cabin, stretching limited rations further than seemed possible. Women woke before dawn on Christmas morning to start the pot, knowing it needed hours to reach perfection. The peas were easy to grow and store, making them a reliable staple. This dish was more than sustenance. It was an act of hope, a belief that better days might come despite all evidence to the contrary.
Ash-roasted corn cobs were the original field ration, born from necessity and fire. When cooking pots were unavailable, enslaved people wrapped whole corn cobs in layers of husk and buried them deep in hot ash until the kernels softened and browned. It was a meal that could travel, carried in cloth or pocket, eaten in silence between labor and rest. The faint char of the ash gave the corn a smoky sweetness that lingered long after the last kernel was gone. In fields where hunger pressed hard, this was survival disguised as simplicity. a meal that needed no utensil, no luxury, only heat and patience. Even after freedom came, many still roasted corn this way, a quiet inheritance of resourcefulness. What began as a means of endurance became memory, passed down through taste and the smell of burning husk. Bourbon balls were the no-bake Christmas treat that let African-American families indulge in a little grown-up sweetness during the holidays. These rich confections combined crushed vanilla wafers with cocoa, powdered sugar, corn syrup, and generous splashes of bourbon, rolled into small spheres and coated with more powdered sugar. The bourbon wasn't cooked out, giving each ball a warm, spirited bite that adults savored after Christmas dinner. Black families often made bourbon balls in assembly line fashion, with some crushing cookies, others mixing, and still others rolling and coating. The candies improved over time, mellowing as the bourbon infused every crumb, making them perfect for preparing weeks ahead. They were stored in tins between layers of wax paper, hidden from children too young for the whiskey but drawn to the chocolate coating. Bourbon balls appeared at holiday card parties and New Year's Eve gatherings. This candy was sophisticated yet simple, proving elegance didn't require an oven.
Sweet potato pone was a Christmas dessert requiring nothing more than sweet potatoes, molasses, and knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations. Potatoes were roasted until soft, mashed with molasses, a little lard, and spices like ginger when available. The mixture was pressed into a pan and baked slowly until set into dense, sweet cake that could be sliced and eaten cold over several days. The texture fell somewhere between pudding and candy, smooth and sticky with concentrated sweetness, making children's eyes go wide. Sweet potatoes grew well in small plots. Enslaved families were sometimes permitted to tend, making them one of the few ingredients people could control. The pone represented agency, a dish made entirely from ingredients grown and prepared by enslaved hands without slaveholder involvement. Families made extra pones to share with neighbors, spreading Christmas joy through food when no other gifts were possible.
Parched corn coffee was the taste of resilience in a cup. When real coffee was beyond reach, enslaved people roasted corn kernels in iron pans until they turned dark brown, then ground them into a coarse powder and steeped it in hot water. The brew was smoky, earthy, and faintly sweet, a humble echo of the luxury drink denied to them. It offered warmth in the early hours before sunrise, when labor began and the cold bit through thin clothes. Parched corn coffee was both necessity and ritual, a way to face the day with something that felt human, dignified, and shared. It was brewed from what the earth gave freely, proof that comfort could still be created from scarcity. In its bitterness was a taste of endurance, and perhaps quiet defiance too. Japanese fruitcake had nothing to do with Japan, but everything to do with African American Christmas traditions across the Deep South. This layered spice cake earned its exotic name from the unusual combination of ingredients: coconut, raisins, and warm spices stacked between alternating layers of light and dark cake. Black families made this for Christmas because it showcased skill and patience, with each layer requiring separate preparation. The white layers were tender and light, while the dark layers were dense with spices, nuts, and dried fruit. A thick coconut frosting bound everything together, often made with freshly grated coconut that families cracked by hand. The cake improved over several days, making it perfect for Christmas Eve preparation. Grandmothers guarded their recipes closely, adjusting spice ratios to family preferences. Japanese fruitcake was celebration made edible, a towering statement that Christmas in Black households meant going all out for those you loved most.
Possum and sweet potatoes was one of the rare Christmas dishes enslaved families could call their own, made from animals trapped in December woods. The possum was cleaned, soaked overnight in salted water, then roasted slowly with sweet potatoes tucked around the edges. The meat turned tender and slightly sweet from the animal's diet of persimmons, while the potatoes absorbed rich drippings until caramelized. This dish appeared at Christmas, because it was one of the few times enslaved people had permission to hunt without supervision. Sweet potatoes came from small garden plots tended after required labor was finished. Possum hunting became a Christmas Eve tradition, with fathers and sons heading into woods with torches and dogs. The dish represented both the pain of bondage and the resilience of people who created celebration from the margins, turning wild game into a feast that carried memory, hope, and quiet defiance against a system designed to strip away every dignity.
Pine bark tea was one of the oldest remedies in the arsenal of survival, brewed from the inner bark of pine trees when other nourishment was gone. The bark was stripped, boiled in water until the liquid turned deep amber, and drunk to fight scurvy, fever, or the chill of endless work. It carried a sharp, resinous flavor, bitter yet strangely comforting to those who knew it well. The tea gave strength when nothing else could, its warmth tracing a line from the forest to the heart. For those denied medicine and rest, this humble brew became both cure and comfort. It was a reminder that the earth itself could provide healing, even when people were deprived of every other resource. Pine bark tea was not just drink, it was proof that knowledge, passed from African and indigenous hands alike, could turn even bark into life. Jam cake was the spiced Christmas cake that turned summer's preserved blackberries into winter celebration across African American households in the South. This dense, moist cake was loaded with homemade blackberry jam, warming spices like cinnamon, cloves, and allspice, plus buttermilk that kept it tender for days. The jam was stirred directly into the batter, giving the cake a deep purple-brown color and concentrated fruit flavor that no fresh berry could match. Black families often saved their best jars of preserves for Christmas jam cake, knowing the cake was only as good as the jam inside. Some versions included raisins, pecans, or a splash of bourbon for extra richness. The cake was typically frosted with caramel icing or left plain, dusted with powdered sugar like Christmas snow. Jam cake connected summer's labor to winter's celebration, proving nothing was wasted in households that preserved the harvest. This cake was heritage in edible form. Ground nut stew with foraged snails was a meal that spoke of survival, patience, and deep memory. When meat was impossible to find or too precious to use, people turned to the land itself for sustenance. Wild snails gathered after rain became the answer to hunger, their shells glistening in the damp earth. They were cleaned, boiled, and simmered slowly in a paste made from crushed ground nuts, the peanut having taken firm root in the soil and soul of the South after its long journey from West Africa. The aroma that filled the air was earthy and rich, carrying the same warmth found across generations of kitchens from Sierra Leone to South Carolina. This stew was not only food, it was endurance turned to flavor. Cooking it required time, care, and an understanding that survival meant transforming the simplest of ingredients into comfort. Those who ate it tasted both hardship and ingenuity in every bite. Fresh coconut cake was the crown jewel of African American Christmas tables, a labor of love that began with cracking open whole coconuts by hand. This wasn't the shredded coconut from bags. This was fresh white meat, grated into fluffy piles that smelled like tropical paradise in December. Black families would purchase coconuts weeks ahead, checking them for freshness by shaking to hear the water inside. The cake itself was a towering white layer cake, but the magic happened in the frosting, a 7-minute icing that required constant beating over boiling water until it formed glossy peaks. Fresh coconut was folded into the frosting and pressed onto every surface until the cake looked caught in a snowstorm. Children would fight over who got to drink the coconut water and eat the leftover shreds. This cake demanded hours of work, but delivered pure Christmas magic. Fresh coconut cake proved that the best celebrations came from effort, not shortcuts. Pickled watermelon rinds were the epitome of making something from nothing, a perfect reflection of the ingenuity that sustained life under impossible circumstances. The sweet pink flesh of the melon was eaten quickly, but the pale rind, normally discarded, was peeled, cut, and boiled in vinegar with cloves and sugar until translucent. Stored in jars, it became crisp, tangy, and refreshing, a treat that lasted long after harvest. It was both preservation and protest, turning scraps into sustenance. This act of saving every part of what little was available revealed a truth. Survival was not only about endurance, but about creativity. These jars lined kitchen shelves like quiet trophies, gleaming reminders that waste was a privilege few could afford. Even now, a single bite of pickled rind carries that legacy, sweet, sharp, and unbroken.
These 25 foods were not chosen from a restaurant menu. They were the actual meals that sustained the first generation of free Black families in the Deep South. No money, no land, no power, and an absolute refusal to go hungry. The kitchens where these meals were cooked are mostly gone now, but the food itself is still here, simmering in pots tonight across the same region where it all started. Drop the one dish from this list that your family never stopped making.